So Allison and Christy, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today on 10 Across Conversations.
Thank you for having us.
Happy to be here.
So we're going to talk about the Arizona Research Center for Housing, Equity, and Sustainability. But before we do that, I want to know how you both came to the topic of housing, and you each bring, respectively, some interesting background that I think probably plays into your perspective on the importance of housing in our society. Allison, you worked with people who had some encounters, if you will, with the Justice Department, and maybe have had some challenges in that regard. And Christy, I know you've been interested in mental health and its role in society. So Allison, why don't we start with you? Give us just a little bit of your background and how that helps you address the matter of housing.
Well, my background has largely been in social psychology and even legal studies. I also have a master's in legal studies here from ASU. I started at the Maricopa County Adult Probation Department as a research analyst, doing a lot of grant work and statistical analysis that supported the work of the probation department. And that is definitely a start for housing. Makes a huge impact for individuals who have a criminal record. They have one of the hardest times finding housing that is available to them and is affordable.
And Christy, tell us a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the assistant research director here at Morrison, and my background is in mental health counseling. That is what my master's is in. I also have a bachelor's in psychology with quite a bit of experience in both education and social psychology research. I was a licensed practitioner for a short time, and I say that because I think that really informs the lens that I bring to the work that we do. We know undoubtedly that mental health impacts many of our realms, and we'll talk a little bit about today how that intersects with housing. But I think also something coming from my perspective is we often try and put a face to the data, right? Tell the stories behind the data. And I think that's something that my counseling background has helped me do in this role, and one of the reasons I enjoy being in this role.
Great. So we're going to talk about the center and its focus on housing with the acronym ARCHES. So when I refer to ARCHES for our audience, that's what I'm talking about. Tell us how this came about and how you see housing through the lens of your background. But how did the ARCHES Center come about?
So the ARCHES Center came about as a collaborative approach. So we have professors and researchers from 4 different universities, and the idea was to create kind of an umbrella to be able to take multidisciplinary research and to be able to inform regional housing policy and practices. And this was funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And this was their very first call for a Hispanic Serving Institutions Center of Excellence. And in fact, they provided 4 of these grants. 3 of them went to Texas and 1 of them to Arizona. And so the idea was that we would be able to collaborate looking at various lenses of housing policy and practice, and be able to involve research that involved geographers, urban planners, policy analysts, economists, you name it. We have a lot of expertise in all different aspects, and it sort of recognizes the importance of how housing intersects all these other policy areas as well, and that it can be informed accordingly. But one of the important parts of the center was that there is an aspect of it that is meant to be community involved, and it's meant to really inform housing policy on the ground, so that it's not just research that gets just published in academic journals. Of course, that's part of it, but that ultimately we are trying to create opportunities for interactions with community organizations, with people in our communities, so that we are tackling the housing issues that are of importance in the moment and potentially in the future.
Great. And I'm assuming that either of you can respond to these questions because I think you're both so intimately involved in the work. So Christy, it would seem that COVID brought on or revealed maybe a lot of issues with regard to housing and just exacerbated them or laid them bare because suddenly where people were, where they were working, where they might have moved to get away from circumstances that might have made them more exposed to COVID or whatever it might be. But somehow COVID seemed to be a tipping point for our understanding of housing. Can you talk about the role that that crisis uh, played in our understanding of this critical issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually going to take a step back and revisit a study that we did that is tangentially related to housing.
Hmm.
In fact, some of how I got on the pathway to being more involved with housing research here at Morrison. That's in 2021. We conducted a study with Hispanic and Latino community members, as well
Right.
as American Indian community members living in the Phoenix metro area. And the study was really to look at whether the state level policies we had in place that address extreme heat were really helping those communities or giving relief to those communities. And a particular focus of this research was looking at how the COVID-19 pandemic served as a disruptor to
Hmm.
kind of those already ongoing challenges. Um, it was interesting because when we scoped out this project, we kind of made an intentional decision that we could not do a landscape analysis of all housing related policies, despite seeing so many connections in the heat policy and programs that we were searching through. But what we did find through interviews with community members is that it, heat directly is impacted to housing, right? And so for a lot of folks, what we heard is that with or without COVID, it's really hard to stay cool inside their homes.
Hmm.
I think that people, and it kind of shows that all housing is not equal, right? People talked about having poor weatherization in their apartments or their homes. People talked about having poor renters in particular, talked about having poor AC units or AC units that aren't working as well as they should be. And so we did hear a lot of that from our community members. And then the COVID-19 pandemic, as you can imagine, really just exacerbated that. So
Hmm.
some of these public spaces they would have went to seek refuge, community spaces, libraries, community centers, they were no longer accessible, right, because of health and
Right.
safety concerns. And so it was really made clear through that study that there's just this inextricable link between housing and health, specifically for our people in Southern Arizona as that relates to heat and how it's impacting these communities. Something I will say that I always like to bring up when I talk about this study is uh, something I found amazing were the ways that our communities are so resilient in finding
Hmm.
ways to then counteract those challenges. We had people talking about doing their own weatherization or versions of that in their home, people finding unique ways to stay cool, even through developing their own AC kind of solutions and eating foods that are cool. And so I do want to say that I think it was really incredible that despite kind of the heavy content that we waded through and seeing how this impacted folks, it was really amazing to see the resiliency and how people, especially in some of these smaller communities, have really worked to mitigate these issues on their own.
Right. And we're going to get into the economics of housing and the lack of affordability in certain areas and market forces. But while we're on this topic, again, I think Allison, you mentioned this at the very beginning. HUD was looking for institutions which were Hispanic serving, if you will. In other words, which already suggests something about the role of demographics that relates to affordability and where people can and do live. Maybe you could speak to why HUD so clearly went in this direction, what they already observed, and why they wanted institutions like yours and the issues that Christy's bringing up, why they wanted people who were particularly attentive to those issues to take on this work.
Yeah, I think that the issues that they have pointed out were really the sort of long-term social inequities that we've
Hmm.
seen with both Hispanic populations and communities of color. They had previously done a call, a similar center of excellence for HBCUs. So that's where they started. And I think they wanted to expand it to HSIs, the Hispanic Serving Institutions, uh, because there was a recognition of both the fact that Hispanics are one of the largest growing ethnic populations in our country.
Hmm.
And with that growth is we are going to see more and more opportunity, but also potential challenges when it comes to housing. And so if we see a population that is generally sort of younger And we are going to see more and more individuals who are Hispanic who are aging into creating households. And this is going to be the kind of the future of our country. But to be able to focus it in areas with already high Hispanic populations allows them to better understand what, if any, specific housing policies or needs are needed to be able to support this type of growth as we continue to see it.
Yeah, and one of the things that attracted me to your work, in addition to the subject matter and the detailed content, and I've got a copy of your report right here, which I'm sure is online for anybody who's listening to this might want to see it. The states where what you just described, where these challenges are most profound, if you will, are exactly those that are in the 10 across transect. Texas, New Mexico, obviously, Arizona, California. So you're looking at the same area with regard to these demographic challenges, but they're also the places where the cost of housing is rising more rapidly than ever has before in a number of these states, and a variety of things like that. Talk about, and maybe Allison, you can start, and then we'll go to Christy. Talk about this geography in particular, because obviously it's also the hottest geography, which Christy was just speaking to. So why is this a particularly useful lens in which to understand U.S. housing generally?
Well, we picked these 5 comparison states to Arizona. Obviously, our focus is in Arizona and kind of the Southwest, but we wanted to pick comparison states with a high percentage of Hispanic populations. There are states that are similar and different to Arizona in a number of different ways, because you can see across the states that we are comparing, California, Nevada, New Mexico, Texas, Florida. These are all states. They have different, political affiliations. They have different makeups in terms of their sort of age of population. We know that Arizona is similar in a lot of ways to Florida for having a large percentage of older people in the population. We also recognize that while all these states have the highest proportion of Hispanic populations, they're also continuing to grow in these states as well. So it allows us to kind of look at states. They're not all the same. Every state is unique in a lot of ways, but being able to kind of see similarities and differences across states, the idea is that we might also be able to learn from each other as well.
Christy, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that, again, tying it back to that intersection between housing and heat and health, just in 2023, we saw that 30% of our indoor deaths happened among mobile home residents, despite this making up only 5% of our housing stock. And so when you think about something like this, again, coming back to the idea that all housing is not equal. And then further, we had 45% of the overall population experiencing homelessness that were unsheltered, and all the challenges and barriers that really come with that. And so yeah, I would just say that it's really hard to disconnect them. And I think in all the states that we're referring to, heat is becoming an increasing issue, and it's not going away anytime soon. So really having to consider it in context.
Yeah, and we've identified this as well, the area of the country where manufactured homes, or mobile homes, as they're sometimes referred to, even though they rarely, if ever, become mobile once they're set on their foundations. This is where those kinds of housing exist, less snow loads and a variety of other things. But these are metal boxes, and they do get hot. And without a mechanical air conditioning, they can be, as you just mentioned, stifling, if not deadly in some cases. Around that topic, and this is probably a little bit outside of your study, have you seen any improvements in the nature of how one thinks about, designs, manufactures a mobile home to respond to some of these conditions? Do you see the market understanding the conditions in which these people live and try to improve that circumstance, Christy?
I think the immediate thing that comes to mind, and maybe Allison, you can speak more or add to this, is there was a House Bill 21, let me make sure I don't want to get it wrong here, House Bill 2146. So that was recently passed, and the idea was it permits mobile home residents to install AC units without the approval of their landlord, which
Hmm.
before I started in this work, I did not even realize was the situation. So
Right.
because they might own the unit, they're still renting the land, right? And so to install an AC unit, they actually have to, prior to this House bill being passed, they had to actually get approval from their landlords, which can become a whole other process and barrier to getting AC. And so that's, I think, one of the improvements that we've seen specific to mobile homes. I'm not sure, Allison, if you have anything else to add.
I think in terms of the structure and building of mobile and manufactured housing, one of the really big challenges is around definitions, because manufactured housing and mobile housing are not necessarily the same, but they're oftentimes
Hmm.
lumped together,
Right.
especially in numbers from the census and that kind of thing. I feel like there's been a lot of advancements when it comes to manufactured housing to create
Right.
some opportunity for streamlining and being able to build pieces off site and be able to bring them on site. But in terms of the mobile housing, a lot of what we're talking about, and when we see these like really high number of heat deaths and people kind of suffering in these places, they're oftentimes older,
Hmm.
less equipped to be able to be lived in like
Hmm.
24/7, 365
Right.
days a year, because they are not really meant for living in all the time in all
Right.
climates. And
Right.
so while you're right, being able to live in warmer climates, definitely, because they're definitely not equipped for cold weather either. But the hot weather has really shown how ill-equipped they are for the summer heats, at least in southern parts of Arizona.
And you mentioned the word definitions, and I think people might be surprised by Christie's definition of a landlord, which in this case really is a landlord, that people living in mobile homes may own the unit, but don't own the land upon which it's sitting. And the idea that you would have to get permission to put an air conditioning unit in your house, which you may own, but go through the person who actually owns the land. And we've also seen this land becoming more valuable and people having to move off that land because it's being sold for other purposes, which is creating real stress amongst those who live in these kinds of situations already. But maybe we'll come back to that. Let's get to the fundamental thing that's in your report, starting at the beginning. Just the sheer cost of housing, the percentage of incomes, the rate of increase, whether you're buying or trying to buy, even though a lot of people who have houses and really are not putting them on the market. So that's a different kind of story. But there's also those trying to rent, and the cost of rent is going up, even in places like Phoenix, where it's always been a place that's been cheaper to some extent, and that's becoming less so as Phoenix grows. But let's talk about affordability and what you see. Maybe we'll start with you, Allison. I think everybody's aware that the housing market has been very expensive of late and difficult, but let's talk about the underlying reasons for that.
Well, I think they're largely economic. We have seen a higher number of people moving in, and we have seen a lower number of units
Hmm.
being built. And so it's really a supply and demand problem for the most part. And the challenge with housing is that it's not like a faucet you can just turn on and turn off. It takes time to build housing when the demand is there.
Would it be
But
fair? Would it be fair to say that part of that is trepidation on the part of home builders, developers post recession? Because Phoenix has often had extreme highs and extreme lows. We've been on the tip of the spear with regard to housing for some time, and people just didn't build for fear that they might go through that kind of situation again. Is that fair to say?
it is fair to say. I think that many developers would even talk about how there had been a large gap in building.
Hmm. Hmm.
After the recession, there was definitely fear and trepidation. There were projects that weren't finished, and a lot of people ended up having to go and sort of reskill or go into other areas. And so when we were ready to turn that faucet back on, we didn't have necessarily all of the skilled labor and people to do all the building that was required. And looking at the numbers over time, there is a gap in housing production,
Right.
and it slowed a lot between 2008 and 2015.
Right.
It was much slower.
Mhm.
So I think you're spot on. I think there was a concern about it, but then as there was a need and there's an increased desire to have more housing, um, the costs of land have increased, the cost of
Hmm.
materials have increased, and so now trying to make things pencil at a
Hmm.
affordable housing price becomes more and more challenging as well.
And Christy, I think people assume higher prices, rapidly escalating prices, is an urban problem, is a city problem. But I think your study points out that what's happening between the major cities in rural, suburban, and rural areas is equivalently difficult in terms of cost and percentage of income and other things like that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Allison, you might be better equipped to expand on this, but what I will say is we know it's across the board. It's absolutely not just our folks in our urban areas. When we look statewide, we know that there are not, and I'm thinking about renters here specifically,
Hmm.
rural or urban, we know there are enough affordable units. There is a huge shortage between the number of extremely low income renters, which is those who are at or below 50% of the area median income, and then the number of housing units that are affordable for those individuals. And so I think that we see a couple things happening here. We see it becoming increasingly harder for people to even think about transitioning from being a renter to a homeowner. But we also see people becoming increasingly strapped with regard to their housing situation or their housing security, even if they are a current renter and are just trying to
Right.
continue to rent because of increasing costs,
Right.
and all these things we're talking about, the shortage of housing.
And by the way, in your study, you talk about the kinds of jobs that people have here. I think you point out five different kinds, and four out of five would cause you to have an income that really puts you below a median level that would allow you to rent effectively or with a degree of comfort, which suggests that's not a housing problem. That's another kind of problem, right? The kind of work that we have, the availability of employment that's satisfactory in terms of your health and well being and that of your family. And Chrissy, I'm sure that the things that you've dealt with in the past around mental health and other things have to be about just feeling secure in your person and the employment that comes with that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Again, we come to this intersection where you really can't untangle these things. So I'm thinking of things like mental health, housing, homelessness, right?
Hmm.
And something that I think really illustrates this point is that we know. So the ultimate result of housing insecurity, right, is homelessness, of course.
Hmm.
And we know that homelessness often comes or is associated with increased mental health and or substance use issues. But what we know is that we don't know which comes first, right? It's a chicken and the egg situation, and that just shows how how much they are intertwined. So we don't know. It's inevitable that if somebody is experiencing homelessness and they're in that heightened state of fight or flight, right? Your body is quite literally at a place where physiologically it cannot perform executive functioning at the level that it is intended to. We know that that's going to
Hmm.
impact all the other things in your life. And likewise, we see people who have mental health issues that then kind of exacerbate or snowball and result in, for one reason or another, homelessness. And so I think what I always come back to when I'm talking about this is that reality that it's beyond a crisis, right? This is touching so many Arizonans, whether it's you directly, whether it's a friend or family member that's struggling with housing insecurity, mental health, substance use, all of these things. And so I think starting to look at it as like a better Arizonan for all, a better Arizona for all Arizonans is the perspective that Morrison tries to take, because we time and time again in our work come across these not only inherent inequities, but also just these um, barriers that people face that seem insurmountable. And so trying to take again that person-centered context and also realizing where we are in the arid Southwest and all of these things that overlap, and trying to create policy solutions that could start to address that.
And our good friend Greg Colburn, who I'm sure you know, the author of Homelessness is a Housing Problem, who's been on our podcast and participated in our 10 Across summits in various cities, including in Houston, would say that if you were homeless, you'd start to self-medicate as well. And thus what you see, maybe drug use or drinking or other things, are symptomatic of the difficult situation in which a person finds themselves. That's not why they're out there. It could be, but that's a symptom of a larger problem, which we're discussing now, which is the economics of housing. So Allison, not building enough and where we build and the kind of housing that we build. We're known in this region for single family homes. People can have a yard, a pool, that kind of stuff if you can afford it. Building multifamily dwellings at a higher level, using less land and other things like that, can sometimes cause people to say, no, not in my backyard, as they'll say, a NIMBY kind of situation, because somehow multifamily dwellings indicate something else. And people are worried about those who aren't living in dwellings that look like theirs. Talk about the turn that we need to make around the acceptability of a different kind of notion of what housing is.
That is a really good point. I mean, I think that there is a shift that is even starting to occur around a openness to seeing housing in many different ways. We've been talking a little bit about the missing middle, for example, and that it doesn't have to go from single family dwellings to a 600 apartment complex, that there is a lot in between. And so being able to have multifamily housing, could be duplex, could be triplex, could be a fourplex, these even smaller but more dense dwellings do create efficiencies, and it is an opportunity potentially for people to get into housing in neighborhoods where you have amenities and so forth, so that you have potentially mixed income housing altogether, so that you are also benefiting from being able to have people who work in your community and who are able to, and we're talking librarians and teachers and police officers. I mean, we're talking about all different types of employment, and to be able to really round out communities instead of thinking about how, well, if you can't afford to live in my community, you're just going to have to commute for 2 hours.
Right.
Because that is a huge cost, both, actual cost in terms of transportation costs, but also in the stress and the sort of additional, sort of lower sort of experience, of, day to day when you're commuting for 4 hours a day and you're still trying to figure that out.
So if you had to, and this is an unfair question because I think it's all of the above, but pinpoint the reasons why this is difficult: community perception, could be zoning, which is often brought up with regard to housing, construction costs, the quality of and the design of these things that are meant to actually be lived in longer term and not just be short rentals and you're gone after a year or two, trying to get a sense of community in these places. I assume it's a combination of all these things that it makes this difficult.
It is. I mean, it is a combination of many things, and I think that it's fair to say that change is difficult for everyone, and so this is really what it comes down to: is people do have a nostalgic sense of their neighborhood and what it has been, and how they'd like to see it. And sometimes it is hard to kind of break through the kind of like, but what would you like to see for your children in the future? Would your children be able to afford to buy a house in your neighborhood? Like, right. Those are the sorts of sort of thoughts and questions that I have. I think that most of us could sit back and say, I don't know that I would be able to buy in my own neighborhood right now. I happened to buy a house in 2013 when the market looked very different. And so the idea that it's maybe not okay for everyone to just sort of shut the gates and say everyone else has to go find someplace else.
And it seems that a long time ago, there are federal housing programs that built housing, and that has diminished radically. I think people look to the states at times, and we've seen Governor Hobbs address this, sometimes successfully, some not. But local communities, in our area where we are right now, Phoenix, Tempe, Tucson, Sedona, are coming up with local strategies to try to overcome some of the barriers to building the kind of housing we're discussing, or expand some opportunities for different kinds of dwellings that maybe were unanticipated previously. I'm thinking of accessory dwelling units and things like that. Christy, you want to say anything about the local response to what's frankly, it's a national problem, but where the problem is being solved?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to try and provide two examples that are kind of on different ends of the spectrum. So again, we can kind of contextualize this issue. So we have something like Tucson, where they've recently received a HUD grant to rehabilitate over 550 housing units in historically disinvested neighborhoods. It also has a temporary housing shelter called the Village, where they are currently
Hmm.
building a second location.
Hmm.
Those are fantastic kind of, I would say, more moderate to long term things that are in place right now. They're in the works. Then we
Federal funding, but motivated by the community wanting to solve a problem on its doorstep.
I think it's
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say too that it's a combination, right, of
Hmm.
both federal and local. That the more you can kind of layer these strategies, the better off these communities are. But it does help if it's rooted in sort of what the community is, what
Hmm.
works for that community.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point. I will say a more local example would be like the Phoenix City Council approved, I think it was, yeah, $9 million to support the preservation and creation of a sustainable, affordable housing through the home investment program. So that is something that was a little more broad scale. And I wanted to kind of have it zoned out because then I think this is a really interesting example of how we're also having to get really creative and innovative because we need short-term solutions, right? We need long-term solutions, obviously. But so in Sedona, they actually are permitting workers to reside in their vehicles. This is through the Safe Space to Work program. And I think it just really reflects the urgent need that we have to address housing. I mean, instead of this was the solution, right? We were like, well, we can't build housing fast enough, but what we can do is permit you to sleep safely in your vehicle. And they do provide showers and kind of security in certain designated lots. But I really just think that highlights that kind of spectrum of need for both acute and long-term solutions.
Again, for some people hearing this, I pointed out earlier your definition of what a real landlord is, and making it possible to live in your vehicle suggests something so much larger about where we are societally. And it seems that the rate of people finding themselves in such a difficult circumstance continues to exceed the pace of our ability to build housing or other things. So it's a difficult topic, and the two of you are really working your best to address it. But talk about the rate of people finding themselves in such a situation and what needs to be done, either one of you, because it feels like we're just constantly trying to catch up and not getting there. So what do we do about that?
I think that this is a huge challenge, right? So we are oftentimes we're trying to tackle the whole spectrum of housing at once,
Hmm.
and we do know that that individuals are falling into experiencing homelessness almost twice the rate as people are being able to be housed from the same community. So this is a huge challenge, and ultimately the responses and stuff have to be further upstream. It's trying to prevent people from experiencing homelessness to begin with. And so when in Christie's example of Sedona sort of creating a parking lot, that's definitely a temporary solution. But these are individuals with good jobs but can't
Hmm.
find a place to live in the place that they work.
Hmm.
And the nearby communities are also so strapped that they don't have housing either. And so they're just kind of waiting for something to open up. And that is the real challenge. And so these temporary solutions seem like they're falling short of where we definitely want them to be. But this is trying to be as sort of creative as possible and sort of thinking about how to um, even share housing or be able to like sort of locate opportunities
Hmm.
for people to be able to work in these various places too. It has been, we've found in an earlier study about how difficult it is to even find housing, especially in areas like Sedona and Flagstaff, where they have a high number of tourists, and it's a very heavily tourist economy. But being able to have housing available and affordable for the people who work there is very challenging.
Yeah.
So they even if they have a higher minimum wage, it's still not enough for people to make ends meet. And that was one of the I think interesting statistics in the report was that sort of statewide, individuals making minimum wage would have to work 86, hours a week
Right.
in order to afford or to not be cost burdened. And that's a important statistics, because what it shows is, coming back full circle, is that the wages aren't keeping up with the costs
Right.
of housing.
Christy, I think you wanted to add something.
Yeah, something I was just going to add to Allison's point about these more upstream solutions. I think a positive shift that we're seeing, not that there weren't folks doing this work before, but we're seeing more predominantly now, is really this focus on prevention, being proactive versus reactive, both with interventions and policy solutions, and the like. And so I think that's also the way we try and approach our work at Morrison. It's often not about is there a right solution. It's what are the trade-offs between the different solutions that get us to different end goals. Because often a great solution is inevitably going to come with some cons, right? And so it's making the decision about where those levers are best weighted, I guess, for lack of a better term, and where really the opportunities exist there.
So you've mentioned the Morrison Institute several times, which is dedicated to public policy and all kinds of issues, including housing, which we're discussing today, and the Arches Center, but also has taken on the challenges of water and a variety of topics that relate not only to this state and region, but frankly to the country. So at the recent summit, which I had the privilege of participating in with both of you putting that together, when housing, and Allison, you gave a summary of your report, which was immediately followed by discussion of water in this region, which was then followed by a panel where people were talking about the cost of energy and how we're going to have to generate more of it given AI and a number of things. When you see the complexities of the context for housing, I can imagine you can throw up your hands and say, this is just freakishly complex. I'm not sure what to do about it. But I assume that housing provides, as I think we're talking here, a really focused lens through which you see who we are as a society, what we care about, what we're prepared to invest in, how we think about our neighbor, literally and figuratively. So talk about the larger Morrison context and the role of housing in that ecosystem. Allison, maybe you start, and maybe Christy, you add something to that.
Yeah, I think that the panel was an opportunity to really think about land use, broadly, and sort of thinking about how Arizona has often seen a lot of growth, and Maricopa County in particular has seen a lot of growth over the past decade or two. It is incredible, but we have relied pretty heavily on importing people to our state, and people like to be here for various reasons. And as we start to think very strategically about the sort of future of our state, it's really taking these various policy lenses and kind of layering them on top of each other, because we want to see our state continue to thrive. We want to live in thriving neighborhoods. So what does that mean to us? So some of it is resource driven, right? We are going to need to figure out the energy and the water and the and air quality. All of these things are very sort of important to the quality of what it means to live here. And housing is obviously, it's very very important to me in the policy work that I'm involved in. But it is kind of the cornerstone, partly because housing ends up being kind of a cornerstone of stability, and sort of thinking about where you live is an important part of what it means to have a family and how you invest in your community. So if we want businesses to come to Arizona, and we want to sort of build a bigger and brighter state as we have done before, and we continue to do, it is like we have to be thinking about what are the impacts on our neighborhoods as well. And so part of it is we need to be thinking about that kind of vision, because even though we have acute needs right now, the sort of growth and opportunity isn't going to go away, and we want to be able to continue to thrive. We don't want, obviously we would solve our housing problem if like half the population just left the state, but that's not what we want for Arizona. That would decrease the cost of housing, because all of a sudden there would be this huge supply and very little demand. But that's also not the direction we want to go either. We want to continue to thrive as a state.
We will not advertise that the Arch's suggestion was that half the people need to leave the state and we'll solve the housing problem. I promise you that. But I think you're absolutely right. Housing is about access to resources, the land, the water that serves those homes, the energy that those homes need. We talked about that, especially because this is a hot environment. And so it's a very close to home, so to speak, topic. What's it like on your street in your neighborhood, but also it's got macro issues attended to it. So, Chrissy, maybe you can help close us out here and talk about the context in which you see your work.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that really the results of housing insecurity, the results of kind of this crisis that we're seeing, really comes at a cost to us all. Whether you want to think about that in actual economic terms, the way that our emergency departments and our first responders are stretched thin, whether you want to talk about that from the human-centered person perspective of these are human beings that are quite literally struggling for their lives on a daily basis. And so I think really it comes back to that. It touches everyone. And I think framing issues and solutions in a way that Arizonans are able to connect with that is what we see as kind of our responsibility for paving the path forward and not only in policy creation, but just conversations like this that can maybe touch broader audiences. And maybe they feel like they can have an opinion or they can be informed or know where to get information where they can become informed. And so, yeah, I think that's really kind of what our goal is.
I think that's a great way to frame it up. And I think you at the Morrison Institute and through the Arches Center have a certain authority, if you will, authenticity with regard to your capacity to speak about this, because Phoenix has been known, as you've been pointing out, Allison, it's a growth place. Building communities and housing has been the nature of how we got post-war to where we are today. And I think the country is looking to some degree at what Phoenix can do under difficult circumstances, hot, water, all kinds of other issues there. If we can find answers to some of these housing questions, surely those are exportable to places that maybe aren't living under such urgent situations. So I think the work that you're doing and what Morrison does generally is really commendable. And I want to thank you for sharing everything that you're doing at the Arches Center around housing. And I can't wait to see next year's report. I'm sure we'll have another discussion like this one. So thank you very much.